Hey, everybody, this is Dr. John back with another episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast. And today I've got a real treat. I'm sitting down with someone who knows business from the inside out and the inside in, which frankly is where most of the real problems hide. Scherr is the founder of Scherr Business Consulting and the host of Business Minds Coffee Chat, where he digs into leadership, mindset, and what it actually takes to build a business that doesn't fall apart the moment the founder steps away. Jay spent more than 30 years in the corporate world before launching his own consulting firm, and along the way, he's become a master at helping leaders confront their blind spots, habits, and inner narratives that quietly shape and sometimes sabotage their results. What I love about Jay is that he's not just talking strategy, he's more in my sweet spot of self-awareness, personal growth, and the kind of leadership evolution that turns good businesses into exceptional ones. So today we're going to dig into the human side of leadership, the fears, the breakthroughs, the, oh wow, I didn't realize I was the problem moments, and how those internal shifts ripple out into culture, performance, and impact. Jay, thanks so much for being here. How you doing?
I am fantastic. What a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for that, John. And it's also fantastic to see you and looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, it's always great to see you. I always enjoy our conversations. We've been on each other's podcast a couple of times, and I value the friendship. So thank you.
Likewise. Absolutely.
So let's get into it. So you talk about building businesses brick by brick. And what were some of the first personal bricks you had to lay down in your own leadership evolution? And which ones were the hardest to confront?
Good question. So you had mentioned in my intro that I had a 30 plus year corporate career. And during those 30 years, a couple of bricks that I had to not only lay down, but also learn to work through was my own ego. So when I first got into my corporate role, I'm excited. It's a new opportunity for me. I had never been in the corporate world before. And for many years prior to that, I had suffered with self-esteem, my own self-value, things like that, and just didn't feel that I was good enough. So when I finally landed that first job, it was almost like an acknowledgement that, hey, you're okay, right? You can do this.
Yeah.
And what happened though is I moved up the corporate ladder fairly quickly within this first organization. But as that happened, my ego, which I had not confronted in the past, just got bigger and bigger. And that caused a number of problems. But of course, I didn't know that at the time, and I didn't know what was causing the issues. So anyway, ego was the first that I had to deal with. And then it was really just a matter of self-evaluation, really assessing my own internal narratives, dealing with that.
Jay, let me pause
ego.
there for a second, because I want to go
Sure.
back and ask, how did you identify that ego is part of the problem? Because I think that's a really common issue for a lot of guys that are coming up the corporate ladder.
Yeah.
And many, if not most, never realize that there's a problem with their ego.
Yeah, another great question. And thank you for pausing and allowing me the opportunity to think about that. So as I go back, for me, it was around other people holding a mirror up for me, because I didn't know it myself. I certainly didn't have the tools. I didn't really have the self-awareness at that point. So it really was thanks to other people who were surrounding me, who were shining a bright light on the things that I was doing, the way I was hurting relationships, the way that I was showing up and thinking that I was bigger than I actually was, and that instead of really working together collaboratively as a team, it was really more about me. What can I get out of this situation? How can I benefit myself? And the more rewards I received, whether it was financial, whether it was titles, trips, things along those lines, it just continued to build that need of self-preservation and to show that I was somebody that was worthy.
How did you respond initially to that feedback or the constructive criticism? Because I think this is where a lot of us really, well, let me put it in my terms. I've struggled with this in the past. I'm good at it now, but it took 50 years to really get comfortable with it.
So the short answer to the question is not well. I didn't handle the feedback very well. I certainly didn't handle the conversations that I felt were really just tearing me down versus looking at the successes that I had had. And really that's what I was hoping I was going to receive, was the attaboys, or wow, you're amazing, you're doing such a great job. So having that type of feedback was very painful. And so I didn't handle it very well. I shut down in certain cases. I would become defensive as opposed to just allowing the conversation to settle and then to ask some clarifying questions. Now, I will say that some of the conversations early on, when this was first brought to my attention, maybe the conversations could have been handled differently, but that's on me, right? The issue was me, and I wasn't accepting that at the time. So I had to learn to listen. I had to learn to just pause, listen to what was being shared with me, and ask for some specific examples that would help me better understand, because this was the first time that I'm hearing this type of feedback, and I just didn't get it. Yeah. And it is painful. So, since it took you said 50 years, and I would say sometimes it's something that I still work on, but
oh yeah.
How did you respond to feedback early on?
Well, I mean, thank you for your honesty, because I think it is a huge deal, and I'm not sure. I think it's there's two parts to it, right? One is I've got to build up a thicker skin. I've got to work on my self-worth in order to receive it well. And I think, at least at my age now, I look at everyone that I deal with as kind of exquisitely sensitive, like that we're all emotional and we all feel things deeply and we all struggle with self-worth. So the other side of it is, how can I phrase this as gently as possible in order to give this other person the best shot at hearing it, whether that's in my relationship with my wife, my new wife, or in business or with a client. So it's interesting to me because I think it's really a skill on both sides in order to be able to receive the criticism well or feedback well, and then to frame it as gently as possible. So for me, I mean, I think I got better at receiving feedback in a professional setting. Where I struggled with it the most was in my relationship, my romantic relationship, because I realized that, and I think this is true for many of us, that it brings up shame. If we really look at it and we're really honest, I don't like to let people down. I don't like to disappoint people. And when they say, John, you disappointed me, I go back to, 5, 6, 7 years old. And I think there's this part of me that goes to, I'm all bad, which is shame, versus I did something bad or wrong, or I just need to improve something. And so to be aware of that difference of I'm all bad versus, this is something I just need to work on. It's not a indictment of my character, of my whole being. It's just an aspect of me, is something that takes some time to develop. So yeah, thank you for your honesty. I think it's a critical point.
I would completely agree. And I think also, when it comes to communication, understanding how different people have different communication styles, right? So when we talk about not only giving feedback, but also receiving feedback, if you're going to give feedback, make sure that you understand the communication style of the person who you're giving feedback to. So, perhaps they may have a certain specific way that they receive and understand information that's coming to them. And it could be partially in written form, it could be verbally, but even in verbal communication, understanding the right time to communicate, how to connect with that person, using words that are going to resonate, making sure that the person understands what was shared with them, giving very specific examples as opposed to being very general in nature. General information often isn't enough to be able to sink your teeth into and walk away with an understanding. And these are all things that I had to learn over time. But you bring up such a great point about shame and about attaching the message that's being delivered to our entire self, as opposed to being able to separate that and assigning it to something very specific. Because it's too easy for us to hear something negative like that and to say, well, that just describes me in general, right? I always show up this way. Therefore, I am this. I'm this negative person, or this person who has this, this horrible, huge ego and, doesn't look out for other people or doesn't care about other people. And that's tough to deal with, and that's tough to work through, but it's also absolutely necessary. So yeah, good question. So does that help answer the question you originally asked?
And I want to move on to self-awareness a little bit, because that dovetails with this nicely. And you and I are both big believers in the idea of cultivating greater self-awareness. And one of my favorite statistics, which I say probably too frequently, is, Tasha Urich's research shows that 95% of us think we're highly self-aware. And the research shows that it's about 12% of us. And to my way of thinking, this is a huge issue for us as individuals, but also as a species. And so how do you think of self-awareness, and why does it matter for business leadership?
Well, first of all, that's a staggering statistic, but I can completely understand it as well, because I think when you ask the question around self-awareness, so if I asked a coaching client, do you feel that you have a high level of self-awareness? Of course, they're going to respond, yeah, of course I do. How could I not? And the reality is, so many of us just don't. And that statistic you just gave proves that. And I look at my own life, and I certainly didn't have that level of self-awareness. I had very little self-awareness. The only thing that I was aware of, which was not the truth to begin with, was the storyline around, and I mentioned this, around lack of self-worth, low self-esteem. And John, and this is not uncommon, but I could find the evidence to support that story and that belief that I had at that time, right? I would go to the ends of the earth just to be able to give an example of where I was not worthy, or where I just had a very low self-esteem. So with that said, I think the self-awareness piece starts with reflection. At least for me, and from what I've seen, it starts by taking a step back and really working to clear the storylines that we've been telling ourselves, and reflecting on what and who I am, what I've been capable of doing, looking for the things that have shown that I know more about my own self, things that have allowed me to be able to move my life forward, looking for wins, things along those lines, and really reframing the storyline that I am telling myself, and building a framework and a social circle around me that is inclusive of people who love me, support me, but are also going to tell me the truth, the hard truth. But the reason I say it's people who love me and support me is because if I'm hearing the hard truth from someone who I don't really know, they may only know me peripherally, chances of me really taking that information to heart and being able to do something with it is going to be at a much lower level than if it's somebody who really does know me. They know my, how I show up in the world. We have a relationship, and I trust them. I trust that individual, and I trust what they tell me. But I need those people, John, around me, because you mentioned about blind spots earlier. I know I have them. There's coaching clients that I work with. Everyone has them,
Hmm.
but you have to have the right person or the right people who can help you identify them first and then start to work on ways that you can remove those blind spots, new skills that you can learn, better ways of developing higher levels of self-awareness, and not allowing it to derail you, but hopefully helping you to be able to grow and to build on some of those areas that you may be falling short today.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. And your point about having people around you that you trust in all capital letters, is key. And I went away for a second because it made me a little sad thinking about the number of people out there that don't have anyone around them that they trust for a variety of reasons. And so critical information doesn't get into them. And I mean, to me, self-awareness, I think of it as, having an awareness of what you feel, what you think, what your values are, how you impact others. And I think I would add like interoception in there. So an awareness of the internal workings of your body, because that's kind of how we figure out what we feel. And I think one of the things I've learned over the years is to tell myself, and then I eventually became, I chose to be intensely curious. And I can be curious about other people, but I can also be curious about myself. And so I look for the feedback now, whereas before, when I was in my 20s, let's say, I think I dreaded the feedback. I feared it, right? Because it did become soul crushing. It did shut me down. I'd get flooded. And, then I couldn't really take in, and it's funny because I think about, like, a lot of times I'll work with clients on taking in the good, like, how do we take in the compliments that we get? This is on the other side of the scale, right? How do we take in the negative feedback, the criticism? And both are equally as important. So how do you see some of this self-awareness kind of impacting business leaders, or the lack of self-awareness?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to speak to the point that you just made about being able to receive the compliments as well as the criticism or the feedback that maybe isn't so positive, right? Some improvement areas. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, and I look back over, my early career, I talked about ego, of course, but for a long time, I had a very difficult time. As much as I wanted it, I had a very difficult time accepting the compliments. I would just kind of push it off to the side and say, oh, yeah, it was nothing, or it was everybody else, or, we have such a great team, right? I couldn't say thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Thank you, and I accept that, and I appreciate it. That was so difficult for me, yet I craved it, which is the craziest thing, right? So dealing with that was really interesting as well. But going back to your original question around, leaders and how you help leaders, or how I help leaders become more self-aware, usually it's, we start with where I talked about self-reflection. We go through a values exercise. We talk about, I ask them to create a paragraph for me on who they are, right? I want them to describe for me more from the inside what type of person they are, what is important to them, the things that really drive them, and the baseline that defines how they make decisions, right? How they go through that process. And then I ask them to give some thought to how other people see them as well. I actually then ask them to go to 5 people and ask them, I'll give them a very specific set of questions to ask those 5 people, because I want them first to think about how other people see them and how they see them showing up, and what they think they value and what's important to them. That's their own self-reflection. But then I want them to get the actual information from those 5 individuals. And we do a comparison, which is really eye-opening because
I'm sure.
usually it is wildly different from what I think that other people think about me versus what they think about me.
In what direction? Because one of the things I could see is 30 years ago, I could see me underselling myself and then getting feedback from other people, and they would think much more highly of me than I did of myself. Now, I would think it'd be pretty much more balanced, but I could also see it going the other way too. Like I have an inflated sense of self, and they're like, no, he's not that good at this. Which way do you see it going more frequently?
Yeah, usually they undervalue, which is really interesting. So
Unless
I'd say
you're,
as
narcissistic.
Yeah, that's true, and that's of course out there. But really, I think based on what I've seen, and this is this is not scientific by any stretch of the imagination, but it is based on numbers, right? So I look at the total number of clients that go through this exercise, and when the majority of them come back and they realize that, wow, I was way off base, or I was considerably off base in these certain key areas. And, that's really, it's interesting because it helps you better understand that your perspective is very different from other people's perspective. Now, does that mean that it's an issue? Well, it certainly can be. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that there's parity between the two when we can. Now, of course, we don't have control over what other people think, but if somebody's looking at me as an example, and they may say that, Jay, you don't do a very good job of communicating vision and mission, as an example. Yet I think that that's one of my strong points, right? That, every meeting I'm talking about our vision. Every meeting, I'm reinforcing our mission, why it's important, what our core values are, things like that, right? I'm a great communicator. That's what I think. But I'm hearing from somebody else based on those 5 questions or the questions that we're asking those 5 people, that isn't necessarily the case. That's a blind spot for me, and it's an opportunity for improvement and growth. Okay, so when I understand the difference between the way that I think of myself and what someone else does, now I have a very specific goal that I'm going to begin to work on. So how do we take that? How do we build the necessary skills to become a better communicator, right? And then we go back and we ask for more feedback. Have you noticed any changes? And we look at this over a 30-day period, a 60-day period, a 120-day period. But we have to have the information first, because otherwise,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Otherwise we just don't have any baseline to work from.
Yeah. And so I love the process. I also love the example, because one of the ways I think about self-awareness is it's not a unitary monolithic construct. It's not like you're self-aware or you're not. It's
That's right.
Context specific, it's niche specific, it's skill specific. And what we're trying to do is chip away and find those little pockets where we aren't self-aware and shore them up or correct for them. And so that example fits right in with that idea.
Yeah. Now, one other thing that tends to happen when you start asking questions and you're surrounding you're reaching out to these 5 individuals, let's say, when you start to get the feedback and you start to realize there's differences between the way that I see myself and the way that others see themselves, and you start to make the corrections, you want more of it, because you start to see that every time I have a conversation with someone else and they're holding a mirror up for me, that it really does help me improve my skill sets. I become a better leader as a result. I become a better manager, better business owner, better husband, better father, right? That begins to happen. And as you start to see and feel, we'll talk about feelings here, when we start to feel the improvements, it's like going to the gym. You know it takes a lot of work. You don't see the results immediately, but once you start to feel the results, you kind of walk by a mirror and you realize that maybe you look just a little bit different than you did 6 months ago. Other things start to change as well. You're changing your eating habits. You're changing the materials that you begin reading. You just feel better. And the same thing happens when you become more self-aware. You want more of that self-awareness. That's what I've seen. What about you? I'm curious.
I agree. I'm also thinking in the back of my mind, like one of the things that Jory and I, my wife, we're working on a book right now for relationships. And we've come to the conclusion that emotional safety is really the gold standard that we're looking for in a romantic relationship. If you have emotional safety, a lot of things spring from that. And I think it's the same is true in corporate teams. And we know this is true to some extent, at least from the Google study they did years ago, looking at what are the traits of the most successful teams at Google. And the number one trait was psychological safety.
That's right.
And so it strikes me that we need some degree of psychological, I would say emotional safety in order to give and receive feedback in not even the most effective way, in an effective way. What do you think?
I completely agree with that. That's a fascinating study. And when you don't have psychological safety, and that's not part of your company culture, people shut down because they feel that it's not an environment where they can be open, where they can be candid, where they can be vulnerable, where they can ask for help, right? We have to have that feeling that it's okay and it's safe, and that if I bring something up or have a conversation or share something that's very personal, but I realize that it's affecting my work, my ability to be able to lead, if I can't have those conversations, then I can't change. I can't grow, right? I don't feel safe enough to have those conversations with anyone in the work environment. So what do we end up doing? We either shut down or we try to find the people elsewhere where we can feel safe and have those conversations. It is a huge factor today in company culture. Now, I've seen a shift, at least in some of the companies that I deal with, and then other companies that I study, but a shift moving more toward psychological safety, more toward having open, honest conversations that, quite frankly, we probably never would have had years ago, right? But today we realize the importance of it, and it enables employees and other stakeholders to thrive in an organization, right? You no longer feel like I can't, like I'm weak, or I need to, to push these feelings down. I can actually create an environment where I can have conversations like this, learn from others, and not feel the shame that I would feel by not being able to have those conversations.
Yeah, and it makes me think of kind of, in my mind, I think of them as old school business cultures that run on fear and intimidation and power. And
yes,
what we know from psychological research is that activates the people that are lower in the hierarchy. It activates their sympathetic nervous system, the fight, flight, freeze response, that stress response, so that's going to limit the actions available to them, but also the different ways in which you can think are limited in a similar way to fight, flight, freeze. And so you effectively cut out the possibilities of innovation and creativity, as well as personal development.
So keep going on that point. I'd love for you to expand that out a little bit further, because I want to hear your thought pattern there.
One of the things that I got into positive psychology, 25 years ago. And one of the things that we couldn't figure out in psychology for many, many, many years was, if positive emotions are selected by evolution to continue on in our species, why is that the case? What do positive emotions do for us? They feel good, okay, but it's got to be more than just that. And so Barbara Fredrickson many years ago came up with this broaden and build theory that says that positive emotions, they undo the physiological effects of uncomfortable emotions. So it reduces your heart rate, breaks up the cortisol in the blood, reduces pulse, reduces muscle tension. But more than that, when we're safe, we can think more creatively outside of the box. We can innovate. We have space to do that. It also gives us enduring internal resources to help support other people around us. Now, on the flip side, with those negative or uncomfortable emotions, anger, guilt, shame, sadness, fear, what those do is they tend to shut us down. They limit the ways in which we can act. You can run away, you can freeze, or you can fight. But it also limits the ways in which we can think. Because I can tell you, if I'm being chased by a bear, I'm not really in the mood to think creatively about a marketing plan.
Sure.
And a lot of the things that we respond to in this day and age, our emotional mind is responding to it as if it's a life-threatening situation. So, you were talking about getting negative feedback or constructive criticism. A lot of us will react to that emotionally as if it's a life or death situation. And we get flooded, and then you're next to useless. And so I think, to have greater awareness around what are the impact of emotions on us in terms of our actions and our thought processes, and then to try and take that into account. And I think it's two-sided, right? I think we as individuals have to work on our own emotional management skills and kind of shoring those up and getting a thicker skin and learning how to deal with compliments and criticism more effectively. And then I think on the other side, we also have to learn how to communicate more effectively so that we're not triggering people where possible. Again, back to that kind of idea of gentle communication.
Definitely. Now, I'll share with you that I have a client who, when I first started working with this client, it's a bit of a larger organization, 150, 200 employees. And one of the things that I had asked of this client was to send a self-assessment survey out to the employees to find out, we wanted to find out what type of leader this individual was, and if there are any particular areas that the employees would provide some room for improvement. Let's say, how does this client do with communication? How does this client do with carrying on one-to-ones and evaluations and sharing the mission and vision of the company, setting specific goals, things along those lines. Mm-hmm. So the client said, absolutely not. I'm not going to send that survey out. And the more I probed, the more I realized that in this particular case, he just did not, he was scared to receive the feedback and didn't know what to do had he received negative feedback, which in his mind, he thought that he was automatically going to receive negative feedback. Now, imagine for a moment that you are leading a company and you don't want to hear from your employees about how you're doing as a business owner or as a leader. Are you connecting well with your employees? Do they feel valued? Do they feel seen? Do they feel heard? Right? Do they feel like they have opportunities to be successful in the organization? All of those things I would want to understand where I am today, so I have a benchmark to begin to work toward, right? And a lot of the feelings that were tied up in this from this particular client go way back to his childhood and the way that he was being spoken to and the way that he thought about himself. And it doesn't matter how successful you are. It doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account or what the rating is of your organization. This goes back to psychology. You know this better than anyone. If you don't feel good about yourself, if you feel less than, the money and the way the business is doing, that's not going to carry as much weight and as much meaning, because you still, at the end of the day, no matter what you see on your bank statement, you still feel like crap about yourself.
Well, to quote John Kabat-Zinn, wherever you go, there you are. Right. So you can't get away from yourself, and you can't get away from the feelings of low self-worth. And so, and I've met with dozens of men over the years that are worth a lot of money and highly successful, and I would say are miserable, but they did it all right. They did it according to what we were taught to do as men. And yet we're not taught the skills of how to show up better in relationship, how to have positive relationships, how to manage yourself emotionally, how to increase your self-worth, how to deal with your attachment style that goes back to 0 to 2 years of age, like all that stuff. And so it's not our fault, but I would argue that it is our responsibility to learn the skills simply to be happier, because that's my bias for everyone, is I want them to be happy and successful, or happier.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that I love about your work and the conversations that we get to have, and also listening actively to your podcast, because it is, to your point, it's not our fault, but we do need to take responsibility, right? Yeah. So what do we do about it once we have the self-awareness? How deep are we willing to go? How much work are we willing to put in? And is it worth it? Because I think that, at least in my experience, what I found is that, and I know you've heard this a million times, but you really do have to meet people where they are. I can't force someone to make a change or to do something that I fully believe is going to be transformative for that person until they're ready for it, until they show up and say, I'm ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other part that enters into this that I see with men a lot is it does take courage. I mean, Jory and I are doing a lot of couples counseling these days, and typically it's the woman dragging the man into couples counseling, saying, if you don't work on this relationship, I'm out of here. And so it takes an ultimatum to get them to confront themselves and their fear, in terms of kind of going into this world where we're not that familiar of thought and feeling and communication and relationality. And I also want to encourage the listener to have the courage. And the courage doesn't mean you're fearless. It means you feel the fear and you do it anyway because you know it's the right thing to do. But to have the courage to be able to look at your own shit, your own issues, your own stuff, and how can I improve?
Let me ask you something. What you just said a moment ago, and I see this often myself, but that ultimatum, how do you think that works out based on your own experience and the clients that you've worked with? If someone is given
a couple,
yes. So if an ultimatum is given to the man, let's say, that if you don't come to this, if you don't come along with me, if you don't go to therapy, whatever it is, then we're done. We're over. When an ultimatum like that is given, is the success rate strong?
Well, the success rate of couples counseling in general is about 50%, maybe a little bit over.
Okay.
So, I like to think that the work that Jory and I are doing with this kind of unique model we have, where I see the man, she sees the woman, and then all four of us get together for the relational work, is much more effective than that. And I also think that that's one of the few things that will help to wake a man up and realize, oh shit, I really need to begin to take a look at this. Now, there's kind of a wide variety in that. Like, there are a lot of men come in begrudgingly, and then I try and convince them that, I don't have two horns and, a spiked tail. And that this actually might be somewhat fun and enjoyable, along with, a little bit of work. And I think it can go that way. I also think that in the course of doing this work, you're going to be faced with some things that you don't really want to look at, or Maybe you're hard to digest. I mean, I remember I had one client come in, and it was a couple's client, and we saw them once. The second time we saw them, the husband went on a 20-minute tirade, is not overstating it too much, about our use of the word trauma. And he was really upset that we were using this word trauma. And I, validated how, yeah, I get that that's frustrating for you. I'm sorry. And I can, change my language. And here's what we mean when we use the word trauma. And here's why we use it. And explain big T, little t trauma, and the accumulation of little t trauma, and how it has an impact on us, and how it's basically, I like Brene Brown's definition of trauma as anything that disconnects us from a feeling of safety and security, back to this idea of emotional safety, which, if you honestly look at your life and think about what disconnected me from feeling safe, there's a shit ton of things. Now, that's a low bar. Actually, that definition's from Faith Harper. Now, that's a low bar for trauma, but if you kind of consider it on that level and think of the accumulation of trauma, little t traumas over time, and that enough of those little t traumas can create a big T trauma, I don't know that we get through growing up as men without significant trauma.
I would agree.
Like, I just don't see how it's possible. I'm sure there's a few exceptions out there.
Sure.
But growing up male is inherently traumatic at times. I mean, think of put downs, think of risk-taking behaviors, think of, fights. There's all sorts of stuff, rejection from girls. And so I think it's a fascinating question to me. Thanks for the question. And I think we men are really resistant to doing this work and looking at ourselves. And that's one of the few things that I've seen really force men to say, okay, you're worth it. I'm going to do the work for you.
I think right there, what you just said is the strongest point of all of this, that if the other person, or if the situation is meaningful enough, do we attach enough meaning and importance to it to want to be open to some sort of change, be open to some sort of therapy, whatever it happens to be? And if we can't answer that question honestly with a yes, maybe I'm way off base here, but if you don't believe that it's important enough, I think you may at least take a step and go. But the real change, from what I've seen, happens when the person finally connects enough importance and meaning and pain to the thing that we want to change or transform before it can actually happen.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. Can I share a personal story that
Please.
Is embarrassing?
Okay.
So this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and Jory and I were struggling, and she made an appointment to see a couples counselor. And at this point, I was a little bit depressed and seeing things through a negative lens. And so we go in and see the couples counselor, and we're talking not for very long. And he says, so John, what was it that initially attracted you to Jory? And I had such a negative lens on that I couldn't even access that. I started answering as all the things that were kind of bothering me or annoying me about Jory. And then we, left the session, and we ended up breaking up for a few weeks shortly after that. But going into that couples counseling session, I was at least anxious, if not scared. I was not in a great place. It didn't work well. So even when I go, there's some fear or anxiety to overcome. Now, we went back after we got back together, and we did a couple of 6-hour intensives with a great husband and wife couples counseling team, and that did the trick. But it's interesting to me that even I get nervous and scared about doing this work. None of us like being put on the spot. None of us like being called out on our own stuff. It's not comfortable.
But I think what's really important about what you just shared, and thank you for that vulnerability and sharing the way that you did, but I think what's really important about it for everyone that's watching and listening is that you have the tools, the strategies, the knowledge, the experience that if I'm an outsider, I would listen and I would think to myself, well, geez, John, you have all of these different ways of dealing with situations like that. That makes me much more comfortable knowing that that feeling affects everyone. Yeah. And it's not easy to be confronted with your own stuff. Yeah. And the first thing, and I'm just going to go back for just a moment, because for so many years, feelings for me were they were a no-no, yeah. Right? So I heard it from the time that I was a young kid, and I'm not pointing fingers or blaming anyone, but I got really good at shoving my feelings down and showing
what was your
up.
Nickname back in the day?
It was Stonewall. Yeah. Stonewall. Yeah.
Say no more.
Say no more. Exactly. So, as embarrassing as that is to think about now, it affected so many different areas of my life. And it also affected not only me personally, but affected my relationships. It certainly affected my relationship with my wife, where if I couldn't show or talk about my own emotions, imagine, I mean, that's a very difficult place to be. And anytime something would come up that required a conversation like that, I would do everything in my power to avoid it, to walk away, to change the subject, to talk about something else. I was just out of there, either mentally or physically.
Well, and it's interesting to me because I think that's the first strategy of every man pretty much I've ever talked to, including myself. Suppress them, stuff them down, ignore them. Yeah. I don't want to deal with this shit. This is painful. This is uncomfortable. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't even know what I'm feeling. But I know I'm feeling something and it's bad. And that's a limited strategy. Like, that strategy can only take us so far before we start to erupt and go volcanic or get really anxious. I mean, I think that suppression of a bunch of different emotions can either lead to volcanic anger or, losing your temper, or a high degree of anxiety, maybe depression as well. And so I have a lot of compassion for men. Mm-hmm. I also want to motivate them to evolve.
And you had said something earlier that if these emotions, if we continue to push them down, if we don't confront our own selves and why we feel the way that we feel, that each of these different situations, they stack on themselves, right? And it creates a ripple effect that really does begin to grow. And that's where you talk about that volcanic eruption, right? Mm-hmm. And that's so true. And what's interesting, and I know you see this as well, but when we have an argument about something with a significant other or somebody in the workplace, and we've had that situation where we've just not addressed our own stuff, typically the argument that we're having is really not about the thing that we're arguing about. It's more about ourselves and the situation that we're dealing with and the way that we feel about, the negative feelings we have toward ourselves. And unfortunately, that ends up coming out in other ways. And so going back to leadership and working with business owners, you got to get your stuff right. Leadership and being an effective leader of others starts with leading ourselves. Mm-hmm. Leading ourselves, a huge part of that is self-awareness, owning our stuff, owning our feelings and our emotions, and continuing to work on those. Because if we don't, it's going to affect you talked about this before, it's going to affect our ability to be curious, to iterate, to bring the best ideas, to collaborate with others, to be effective in the way that we show up. It affects everything. Mm-hmm. That's where it always starts. If you want to build a successful, thriving business, build you first.
Yeah.
Build you first.
Yeah, thank you.
Work on that.
I mean, it's interesting. As you're talking, it makes me think of this really simple framework that we use with couples, but it's really applicable to every relationship that we have, leaders as well, where in every relationship, there's you, there's me, and there's us. And so to have clarity about, like, let's say you and I get in an argument, is this about us? Is this about you? Or is this about me? Or some mixture of those? And it's the most fruitful way to go there is to really focus on what's my part? What can I do better? What can I change to change this dynamic? Because all too often we see, this kind of dynamic where, I'm mad at you and I'm thinking if you just stop being such a fill in the blank, I wouldn't be so pissed off, and you're doing the same. And so we externalize blame, but I can't get you to change. Like, the only thing I can control is me. And so, I love that idea of just being clear, especially in romantic relationships, of, is this something I need to work on, or is this relational work that we need to do, or is this my partner's work? And just to give you an example, like,
yeah, please.
I would shut down in arguments with Jory, and I would get flooded. I didn't want to say anything in anger. So I'm just going to shut up. And I would just stonewall. So speaking of, and we know, when I realized that, I was like, oh shit, stonewalling's not, like, that's one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, according to John Gottman. Right. It's not a good behavior in relationship. So I was like, okay, so that's on me. Like, that stonewalling behavior is my issue. I need to find a way to deal with that. I'm getting flooded. I'm going to shame. That goes way back to my childhood. And so I also love the idea from Terry Real. It's a really simple phrase. It's, if it's hysterical, it's historical. In other words, if your emotional reaction is out of proportion to what's actually going on, like someone putting a dirty spoon in the sink, and you lose your mind, that's not about the spoon in the sink, to your point earlier. That's about, like, not being seen, not being heard, not feeling respected, going way back. And so, that's your issue if you're losing your mind about a dirty spoon in the sink. So I like the simplicity of that, because I think we need simplicity when emotions get into the picture.
Absolutely. I love that phrase. And another thing that I think is really important to mention is, you've been at this for a while. I've been at this for a while. Of course, your knowledge on the psychology side and counseling and so forth is leaps and bounds above where I am, which is one of the reasons why I love being around you and learning from you. But always remember that it takes work. It takes time, it takes commitment, it takes discipline, it takes the self-awareness. But everything that we've been talking about requires, and I wore this shirt on purpose, it requires doing the work.
Yeah.
We do the things that are most important. The things that we don't do, that we're choosing not to do, is because we haven't attached enough meaning to it. So whether it's in leadership, business ownership, entrepreneurship, in your personal life or professional life, whatever it is that you're working toward, it has to, number one, be important and meaningful to you and to others. And I'm going to go back to the one thing that I had mentioned to you about meeting people where they are. I look around a room of business owners and I can see through the line of questioning, through the way that they're interacting with others. I can see the discomfort. I can see the challenges that they're facing, that they're having a difficult time confronting, because at that moment in time, although it's painful, they haven't reached the point where it's important enough and they're ready for the help. And if they're not at that point, then I can't help them. I can offer suggestions, but the chances of them committing to doing the work is just not there. It's not strong enough.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking, holy shit, like it sounds so much like an addict, an alcoholic, right? That we're addicted to ourself, we're addicted to our narrative. And if until it's painful enough to actually address it honestly, we'd rather do anything else.
That's right.
Wow.
Huh. And John, that could be bleeding out on our P&L. It could be destroying relationships. It could be losing, from a business perspective, it could be losing employees and not caring enough to find out why and realizing that I'm not holding myself accountable.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and again, a CEO or an owner could be externalizing blame onto the employees that are leaving, like, oh, they're lazy.
Absolutely.
Or they're young and they don't know how to work. Or I mean, yeah, again, you, me, us. So Jay, thank you. Because I love speaking to you, because I'm always learning about business and strategy, and I love your view on things. And before we wrap up with that, kind of voice made for radio, tell us how people can get a hold of you.
Sure. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So really my one-stop shop to learn more about me, learn more about my coaching, consulting, advising business, as well as check out the podcast. You can just visit Jay Scherr, and Jay is Jay Scherr, businessconsulting.com. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, if something that we talked about here landed with you and you want some additional clarification or context, reach out to me. I'm highly accessible on all the socials. And also make sure that you check out the episode that John and I recorded together on my podcast, because what I loved about that conversation, John, and just very briefly, is we go pretty deep into your personal story that led to the work that you do today and how you change and transform lives. And I love that story, and I love getting to know you on a deeper level. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. That feeling's mutual. And yeah, that episode was about self-worth, which was, it's a topic near and dear to my heart lately, because I think we all struggle with it at times. And I think it's important to shore it up, to learn how to love yourself. So thank you for that. And that's it for this episode of The Evolved Caveman. May you, the listener, have the courage to look at your own shit. Until next time, this is Dr. John signing off.